All right, well, let's move to our next integrative approacher, our good friend Francis Schaeffer,
Yeah.
right? And, he was born in 1912 and died in 1984. They tell us that he was one of the most beloved Christian apologists of the 20th century. His influence was so great. Notice that Newsweek once called him the guru of fundamentalism. How about that, right? There are many
Back in the day.
reasons. Yeah. So there are many reasons for Schaeffer's popularity, but they suggested two stand out.
Yeah.
First and foremost, Schaeffer embodied the ideal of an apologist who sought to, quote, speak the truth in love, right? So he was he gathered people into his home. He talked to me. It was a kind of the love thing.
Yeah.
Second, they tell us that Schaeffer inspired evangelical Christians to broaden their approach to apologetics beyond the usual disciplines of philosophy, theology, science, and history, and that sort of thing. And he says we should be talking about ethics and arts and all of life, right?
Yeah.
And so that was another way that why Schaeffer was so popular.
Yeah. Yeah. I highly, highly always recommend Schaeffer to people, either to get a grasp on that. It's not just the big things in life, but it's also the other big things in life that Christianity can speak to. He flavors his entire apologetic argumentations in his apologetic books with things like art and literature. Recognizing of objective beauty and those things. And then on the opposite end, when he's talking about cultural things, he draws back to having a logical, consistent view within the scope of it. And so we talked about that as well. And when we interviewed Nancy Pearcey after we did her book, we of course had to talk to her a little bit about Francis Schaeffer because she was one of his students and sings his praise as well. So you can always check back to our interview with Nancy Pearcey to find out more. But pretty much pick up any book by Schaeffer. In fact, I believe on YouTube he did in the 70s. He did kind of one of his books in video
How
form.
Shall We Then Live?
That's
think
it.
was
Yep. Yep.
it was a documentary or presentation of that particular material that was in this book.
It reminded me of when Milton Friedman did one of his books in kind of similar fashion, went around the world and showed the products of his Chicago School of Economics, and it's Schaeffer going kind of around the world and showing the approach there. And we can kind of thank him for some of the initial talking points of the abortion conflict and how just it's not a fight only for the Catholics to do, but it's something for us Protestants and all peoples to take on. So yes, we will always sing praises of Schaeffer, even if Bonson writes against him in later works that have to be discovered in a file drawer.
That's right.
Well, Schaeffer's apologetic method has been subject of considerable debate, and even while he was alive. Within 3 years of his death, 4 major books appeared evaluating his thoughts and offering marked different analysis of his apologetic approach, which should tell you about his popularity, because if they're writing about you before you die, that's impressive. And then, if they have to wait until after you die, that all these different books come out, that's also a high praise, I would say. The diversity may be best explained on the view that Schaeffer had developed a distinctive apologetic that has important affinities with more than one of the 4 standard approaches.
Right. And so the first one then is the classical approach, right? Schaeffer and the classical approach. So they suggest that Schaeffer distinguished his approach from classical apologetics, but didn't criticize the classical approach. As he saw it, classical apologetics was effective because most non-Christians accepted the elemental laws of logic and the reality of absolutes, though not the true absolute of God. He taught that modern man's lack of confidence in logic and his relativistic view of truth made it ineffective to conduct apologetics without challenging such epistemological issues. But the use of classical apologetics before this shift to the modern man's approach, right, took place was effective only because non-Christians were functioning on the surface anyway, on the same presuppositions. And even if they had an inadequate base for them, they still functioned that way. So the idea here is, he says, that you could use this classical approach because we were all, for the most part, working in the same worldview until, of late. And so obviously when that worldview changed and the non-believer, the non-Christian began to not accept the Christian worldview. And of course, then you had to use different approaches. Mm-hmm. But initially you could use this classical approach because everybody was viewing the world the same. Now notice he says the unbeliever had this basic worldview, but they didn't have a basis for the worldview, right? As a Christian did.
Yeah. And that, again, that takes that product of the kind of the 50s and 60s that would start a kind of revolution to divorce Americanism away more from Christianity. And I would argue that's probably a good thing, because then your churches actually have Christians in it instead of just Americans.
Right. But it forced the issue for churches.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And also led us to need to speak out against different things. And now we're playing by what standard? And so that's what Schaeffer's getting at there is if you're going to talk about kind of the general ethics of the kind of the people that you're living with and working with and interacting with in the community, the shared understanding of the biblical Christian God, at least giving the standard kind of ethical framework that informs our laws and how we interact with people. And C.S. Lewis has this really great line in one of his books where he says that he knew an atheist man who tended his garden every day, including on the Lord's Day, except on that day he wore a suit and something that and nicer socks, and it was something that where he even admitted okay, I don't believe in this, but there's something different about Sunday that I have to kind of dress up a little bit. So I always think of that line here for that type of approach. And so, as we've more advanced away from the Christian worldview, well, look where it's gotten us, and now we have to draw people to that's a belief system, but by what standing do you have to hold to that? So that's what Schaeffer's getting at there. Well, his apologetic retained some elements of the classical model. As in classical apologetics, he advocated a two-stage defense that moves from God as creator to God as savior. Schaeffer's argument for the existence of the creator is most fully set out in He is there and He is not silent, which, again, I'll recommend anything by Schaeffer, but kind of his 3 books there, this being one of them, is really excellent. The Christian Manifesto is also an excellent one that I would highly recommend. As a classical apologetic, Shaeffer analyzes this question in terms of the basic alternative worldviews and the answers they give to the question of the existence of or the existent or being. So that's what he does there.
Yeah. And so the possible answers to why something rather than nothing is there, he said, and Shaeffer taught, boil down logically to just 4 kind of positions here. So the question is, why is there something rather than nothing? Right? And the first position is, well, once there was absolutely nothing and now there's something. So the idea is, everything came from nothing, right? Secondly, everything began with an impersonal something. So that's the second position. Third, everything began with a personal something. And then fourth, there is and always has been kind of a dualism. So those are the 4 positions that Shaeffer suggests that are answers to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Mm-hmm. Now, notice the first answer, he says, is actually quite rare once the point is pressed that the beginning must be from an absolute nothing, what Shaeffer calls nothing.
Yeah, which you have to do because there are people that write it all came from nothing, and what I mean by nothing is not really nothing. Right. So your Lawrence Krauss's tend to do that.
So you have to nail them down with what do you mean by nothing, right? Yeah. And of course, our book suggests that, one is reminded of Norman Geisler's version of the cosmological argument, in which he emphasizes that, nothing comes from nothing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The
And
nothing.
if you've seen William and Craig expand the Kalam argument, and I think it's in Case for Creator by Strobel, he branches it out and shows, is it personal or impersonal, and argues from there. And so these kind of four approaches inform past the Kalam argument to get him further in the one-step approach that he will then shift over and then
Right.
argue for the Christian version of Jesus.
And our book actually has a nice chart in this area of these four approaches that are kind of laid out. And so that's really helpful.
Yes, yes. Well, Shaeffer also dismisses dualism as an answer, since it inevitably reduces to one of the two remaining options. So, John Frame would be happy that we get to three there. By far the most popular answer among non-Christians is that everything began from something into some impersonal beginning. It's the vacuum that these postules come in and just happen to populate and then fizzle out. And so if that can do it, then so can the entire universe and everything, and it explodes and creates everything. Well, this view of Flounders because it leaves us with no basis for attributing purpose or meaning to anything, including us, including man. Schaeffer said, if we begin with an impersonal, we cannot have from some of the teleological concept. No one has ever demonstrated how time plus chance, beginning with an impersonal, can produce the needed complexity of the universe, let alone the personality of man. No one has given us a clue to this. And so unless you want to be a complete nihilist and try and operate within that, that's going to be a hard sell for you, especially when you get to the oughts and is and should do's and shan't do's.
Yeah. And so this leaves us as the only remaining possible answer that ultimately everything owes its existence to a personal beginning, right? And so Schaeffer here follows a strategy similar to that employed by Geisler, who is a classicalist, right? Set forth, the basic worldviews: atheism, dualism, pantheism, finite theism, theism, and so forth. And then show that all of them except theism is irrational. So that's kind of the Geisler's approach. So as in classical apologetics, Schaeffer concludes that a worldview in which everything was created by an infinite personal God is the only worldview that provides a rational, adequate answer to the question of why there is something rather than none.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, how about Schaeffer and evidentialism? While if any students of Schaeffer would conclude that the classical model dominated his approach to apologetics, some do contend that he is properly identified as an evidentialist. He suggests the scientific proof, philosophical proof, and religious proof follow the same rules. After the question has been defined, in each case the proof consists of two steps. The first one is the theory must non-contradictorily and must give an answer to the phenomenon in question, which we saw kind of with our last one too. And we must, the second of all, we must be able to live consistently with our theory, which I think might put us into a different camp with those two. But all right, evidentialists can try and have a piece of Schaeffer as well. Christianity is proved by the fact that it and it alone does not offer a non-contradictory answer, which explains the phenomena and which can be lived with both in life and scholarly pursuits. And I'll harken back to our book of Finding Truth with the five avenues that Nancy Pearcey does. This is what she does in just kind of a 5-step approach. She does this. Can it be non-contradictory and self-answer to explain all the phenomenon, and can you live consistently within it? I always talk about the squid or the octopus, where you're trying to put all the tentacles in the box, and if something falls outside of it, then you just dismiss it away and say, oh, that's not true, or just it's your mind playing tricks on you, or only I can see that tentacle and only I can explain it away.
Right. And so she uses boxes. I think his metaphor is the 2 levels, right? You have one level and a different level.
What she does in her newest book, it's actually not her newest book, but Love Thy Body, I believe is the name of it. She does that dual aspect to it as well, and that's a phenomenal book too that I would recommend. So you're getting a lot of book recommendations here.
Yeah. All right, well, let's look at Schaeffer and Reformed Apologetics. So like Carnell, Schaeffer was a student of Van Til, right? And like Carnell, he is commonly identified as a presuppositionist by classical and evidentialist apologists, and as an evidentialist by Reformed apologists. Go figure, right? So the classicalists and the evidentialists say, well, he's a presuppositionist. And the presuppositionist says, no, he's an evidentialist, right? So on the one hand, Schaeffer sometimes seems to express himself as only a presuppositionalist would. Yeah. But on the other hand, Schaeffer denied being either a presuppositionalist or an evidentialist. And so evidently what he meant was that he did not wish to limit himself to one or the other of these two positions.
Yeah. So sometimes people that want to have the purest form of whatever tend to do less in the physical manifestation of it. And he was all about the bringing people in and talking with them in L'Abri, or doing these documentaries, or wanting to speak out into further than just the two other Christian apologists. He wanted to kind of speak to the world and talk about all these various different things. So sometimes it's just best to say I'm all and neither of these things, and I'll fall where I may, and not focus too much on it. So I appreciate that about him, at least. But Bahnsen writes about him in Presuppositionalism, Stated and Defended, and so if you kind of want a critique of Bahnsen's view of what Schaeffer is, that's a book to go through. But that book's a little bit on the heady side, even for me. All right, well, Schaeffer seems to have been indebted to at least three streams of Reformed thought. And the first is theology of old Princeton, back in the day when Princeton used to be Christian. That was the good times, good times. And so the second is the analysis of the Western history and culture produced by the Kuyperian philosopher Herman Dooyeweerd. And the third is of the Reformed influence of Schaeffer is the presuppositional apologetics of Van Til. And you do see the string in Schaeffer on arguing like Van Til.
Yeah. In fact, they give us kind of an illustration of this, right? Both apologists emphasize presuppositions, right? They argue that non-Christians could not give a unified account of reality. That is both Van Til and Schaeffer, right? So they both emphasize presuppositions. They both argue that non-Christians could not give a unified account of reality. Both Schaeffer and Van Til oppose rationalism and irrationalism, but not rationality. They both diagnose man's ignorance of the truth as a moral rather than a metaphysical problem. And they both advocate an indirect method of apologetics in which one assumes the non-Christian position for the sake of argument, right? Clearly, that's what Van Til did, and Schaeffer did the same thing. Mm-hmm. And they both affirm divine sovereignty and human responsibility.
Right. Yeah, so it's kind of hard to fully dismiss him. And, I like Schaeffer enough that I'd include him in our camp too. So maybe he's not in the inner circle, but that's all right. We'll be on the outside a little bit. All right. Well, what about Fideism? Does Schaeffer have any doings on with Fideism? Well, like most conservative evangelicals, Schaeffer was very critical of the philosophy of Kierkegaard and the theory and the theology of Barth, especially when he's an old Princetonian man himself, and contemporary neo-evangelicals. In particular, he frequently criticized the Kierkegaardian notion of the leap of faith. Yet, in fact, there is a strong element of Fideism in Schaeffer's model, the authors say.
Right. What they tell us is that while Schaeffer's theology and theory of apologetics differ significantly from those of the Fideists, his method of apologetics has some striking similarities. For instance, like both Pascal and Kierkegaard, Schaeffer sought to dislodge his hearers from their comfortable delusions through indirect argument. And so that's the idea here, this indirect argument. And of course, that's what the Fideists were attempting to do in their arguments.
Right. So the key to Schaeffer's method is to find what he calls the point of tension. The basis of this method is the principle that no non-Christian can be consistent to the logic of his non-Christian presuppositions. That is, people cannot live in a way that is consistent with unrealistic presuppositions about the world in which they live or about themselves. Non-Christian presuppositions simply do not fit into what God has made, including what man is. And this being so, every man is a point of contention, which sounds very much presuppositionalism as well. And this is kind of the overlap between Fideism and presuppositionalism.
Right. And so then based on that, in order to enable the non-Christian to see this point of tension, we must help him realize the logical implications of his presuppositions, right? This means that we should not start out by trying to change his mind about his presuppositions, but rather to cause him to think more deeply about his presuppositions. You know, Schaeffer says that we ought not to try first to move a man away from the logical conclusion of his positions, but move him toward that logical conclusion, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, the non-Christian must be helped to see that his need, help him to see his need before he's ready to accept the solution. And this then helps him to see his need, because now he realizes we might say bankruptcy of his presuppositions. And so now that opens him up to be able to understand where he falls short.
Right. I love my children, and it's just fizzing chemicals within my head. And so I just take drug and fizzing chemicals occurs. So taking drugs is like loving my children. So push the antithesis there is what we would do. Well, Schaeffer's apologetic method shows affinities to Fideism in its focus on the human condition and need as the point at which non-Christian beliefs are critiqued and the truth of the Christian faith is presented. Schaeffer also sounds a Fideist note when he warns fellow Christians that a valid and effective apologetic must include the practice of the truth and not merely its rational defense. So again, here's the relationship aspect. Here's the it must work out actually in the world, and it's not just you're not going to write down the proof for God on the piece of paper and voila, you just publish it and there it is.
Good. Yeah. All right. And then finally, Schaeffer and integration, right? Schaeffer's formal method of apologetics was shaped primarily, though not exclusively, by Reformed apologetics, including the presuppositionalism of Van Til. However, his actual argument for the existence of the God of the Bible closely follows the classical approach, our authors tell us. And he affirmed the verifiability of biblical Christianity in terms of compatible with some forms of evidentialism. And so the practical application of his apologetic, on the other hand, assumes the central Fideist contention that the truth must be lived and not merely affirmed. So we see really an integration here they're suggesting of all four of these positions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, that matches with kind of what I think he desired as well. So